On today's episode, Celtics player and future NBA superstar Paul Pierce's incident with a famous Boston rap entourage. What's up, everybody? Welcome back. I have one last installment of my Boston lore series before the holiday for you guys. I've had a lot going on this week, like I'm sure everyone else who's watching this video has. It didn't hurt that I had another rain closure, so I had some extra time to make this video. It did hurt my wallet, though, I'll tell you that much. I was determined to have a video for you guys this weekend to enjoy through the holiday, and this is an exciting video to present. Not only is this a story that I've wanted to do since starting the channel, but it's also one of the most requested video topics I've had as well. Now, it's impossible to make everyone happy, and although I do try my best, I honestly do, I'm sure some people might get upset at this video, so I apologize ahead of time. I'm not going to implicate anybody of anything or speak on things that can't be found on the internet or through your own research. Now, with that being said, just try to sit back and relax and enjoy another tale from Boston's sordid past. A young, talented Celtics player who would go on to become an NBA superstar, but it almost never happened. After a run-in with a notorious Boston rap entourage with deep street ties, he almost didn't make it to his third NBA season. By the end of the 90s, the Celtics weren't quite the powerhouse in the NBA that they used to be. It's quite the opposite, actually. But let's backtrack a little bit. The Celtics became the most storied franchise in NBA history after winning an unprecedented 9 titles in a 10-year span. After owner Walter Brown hired Red Auerbach in 1950 as the Celtics GM and head coach, their fortunes changed. In 1956, Red Auerbach traded 2 players to the St. Louis Hawks for their first-round draft pick. With that pick, they drafted Bill Russell, who in my opinion is one of the most underrated players in NBA history. They won 7 titles in a row before finally being beaten by Philadelphia in 1967 in the Eastern Conference Finals. Philly would end up going on to win the title that year. But then Boston bounced back and won the next 2 titles, rounding out the decade. There's never been a team that has that type of dominance in the NBA, or professional sports really for that matter. Maybe the Yankees of the 1920s or the Patriots of the early 2000s. Either way, the 1960s cemented the Celtics legacy as one of the NBA's all-time heavyweights. Again in the 1980s, Celtics fever caught the city by storm. This is the team that I grew up with, and it's probably why the Celtics have always been my favorite Boston team. It was once again Red Auerbach who had the big pick when he drafted Larry Bird from French Lick, Indiana in 1978, and the C's again made championship runs. Larry Bird is one of my favorite personal heroes, more so because of all the stuff he overcame in his early life and his work ethic than anything else. Bird led the Celtics back to prominence in the NBA and in the meantime started one of the greatest basketball rivalries in history. During the 80s, it was Bird vs. Magic, but to this day it's still to an extent a rivalry between the Celtics and the Los Angeles Lakers. The Celtics of the 1980s captured the city's attention and admiration. They also won a few titles, 3 to be exact, in 1980, 84, and 86. Bird, Parrish, McHale, Johnson, and Ainge were the core of that team. They also lost twice to Magic Lakers in the finals, 85 and 87. They made 5 total finals appearances in the 80s alone. This run wasn't even as close to the dominance that the Celtics had shown in the 1960s, even though I feel like this team is more talked about in the media. I think it's because Bird and Magic basically saved the NBA in the early 1980s before Michael Jordan came around. If you're a sports fan, watch one of the many documentaries about this time period or their epic rivalry. If you don't know much about Bird's personal history, watch a documentary about his life. I promise you it will blow your mind. Well, after the Celtics' last title in '86, their fortunes turned south, and for a while, honestly, they seemed like a cursed franchise more than one that had been touched by an angel. After just winning 2 titles in '80 and '84, the Celtics also had the number 2 pick overall in the 1986 draft. In the highly anticipated draft that took place in Madison Square Garden in Midtown Manhattan, the Boston Celtics chose Len Bias of the University of Maryland Terrapins. The city of Boston was wild. Everyone was anticipating the 3 championships of the 1980s to be just the beginning of the run, not the end. Len Bias was an incredibly gifted athlete. He possessed natural abilities that few others are born with. When local legend Steve Rowell was explaining to us kids about how gifted Bias was at his annual Cape Ann basketball camp at O'Malley Middle School in Gloucester, he told us kids Len Bias could jump so high and had such incredible hang time that he could jump up, take a quarter off the very top of the backboard, and replace it with 2 dimes and a nickel while in midair. Of course, this was just a chief, and that's what we referred to Coach Rowell as. And I just have to say this, he was an awesome guy who helped out a lot of kids. He was a local basketball star from Rockport who played in the NBA for the New York Knicks, an old Washington team that no longer exists. But it was just his colorful way of saying that Len Bias had unmatched natural athletic ability. So obviously the Boston fans were expecting big things when this fresh new talent jumped onto the NBA championship squad. Unfortunately, tragedy struck not even a full 48 hours after Len Bias was drafted to the Celtics. Apparently, the story that I've always been told was that Bias, who was an athlete and basically just a good kid, was out celebrating with some friends and he experimented with a South American product that was destroying the U.S.'s inner cities at the time, and unfortunately, he had a heart attack and died. It was said that he had never smoked it before and this was his first time experimenting. I'm not sure if that's just a story that his family and friends wanted to present to the world. I personally happen to believe that that's the truth and it was just an unfortunate tragedy. He was in his hometown of Riverdale Park, Maryland, which is actually right outside Washington, D.C., and is on the complete other side of the state of Maryland in the city of Baltimore. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Washington, D.C. was becoming synonymous with what was happening in the U.S. at the time, and Len Bias's death was just more fuel for that fire. Celtics fans and the entire franchise felt the loss of Bias. It was a senseless loss of a young life and a waste of precious talent. He became an unfortunate poster boy for the Just Say No campaign and the DARE program. Len Bias became the ultimate cautionary tale. If you tried it once, it could be your last time. The Celtics after this would have no luck if it weren't for bad luck, it would seem. Larry Legend, aka the Great White Hope, which is a side note if you watch documentaries on Larry, he never wanted that title and detested that race was always involved when talking about him. He personally got along with everyone, if anything more so with black guys, which predominantly is who he learned a lot of his basketball technique from as a kid. But through the end of the 80s, Larry Bird's body broke down and he couldn't compete at the level he used to. He pushed his body to the max every second he was on the floor. So much so that at the end of his career, the majority of the time he was off the court, he spent in a full body compression cast. The Celtics, knowing that Bird's career was coming to an end sooner or later, started trying to build a new younger core. A year after the tragic loss of Len Bias, the C's drafted another Maryland prospect. In the 1987 draft, the Celtics chose Reggie Lewis, who came from the rough city of Baltimore, Maryland. Lewis attended the legendary Dunbar High School and actually played alongside other future NBA talents David Wingate, Reggie Williams, and the 5'3" Muggsy Bogues. I loved Muggsy Bogues when I was a kid. Him and Larry Johnson on the Charlotte Hornets were awesome. Anyways, Lewis, who attended Northeastern University and still actually holds the all-time scoring record there, was scooped up by the Celtics as the 22nd overall draft pick. Lewis was a strong offensive player and he was very well liked in the city. Being from the tough city of Baltimore, he could fit in while mingling with people from the neighborhoods like Roxbury that Northeastern bordered. By the time he was drafted, he was very well acquainted with the inner city of Boston after attending college for 4 years here. Reggie Lewis was a solid NBA player, but more than that, he was a good person and was well liked in the city, especially in the black neighborhoods. Many residents in the greater Roxbury neighborhood had plentiful Thanksgiving meals thanks to Lewis's turkey giveaways. After attending Northeastern, he remained committed to the area even as a pro, and the residents admired him for it. Lewis was a man that didn't forget where he came from, and it showed through his many charitable acts in the community. Lewis would hold open practices for local kids to come shoot around with him. He visited local schools and talked with kids about basketball and just life in general. He could empathize with what a lot of young kids were going through. He experienced a lot as a kid in Baltimore. Unfortunately, before Lewis and the Celtics, with him as a member, could achieve any milestones, tragedy struck once again. On July 27, 1993, while practicing at their off-season location at Brandeis University's facilities in the Boston suburb of Waltham, Lewis suddenly collapsed on the court. Lewis had been plagued recently by cardiac problems. He had fainted just a few months before in the playoffs. Lewis's death stunned Celtics fans and the city of Boston overall. Lewis was only 27 years old and seemed to be in top physical shape. He was a professional athlete. But after he fainted in the 92-93 playoffs against the Charlotte Hornets, fans as well as the Celtics organization were very worried. After going back in the game and scoring 17 points, he was pulled out again for feeling dizzy. He went to the hospital where various tests were run. 4 out of the 7 tests showed a condition that affected the muscle wall around his heart. In Lewis's case, it centered around the bottom of his heart. Lewis, of course, had a hard time accepting this, so the Celtics formed a dream team of cardiologists and other doctors to form a diagnosis. All 11 doctors and medical professionals agreed that Lewis in fact had a cardiac condition and the tests were accurate. Not wanting to accept the end of his basketball career that was just only beginning, Lewis sought a second opinion at the world-famous Brigham and Women's Hospital. There they found a better diagnosis for his basketball career. They diagnosed Lewis with a neurological disorder that caused him to faint. While researching this and reading stuff about Reggie Lewis, I realized I should just do a future video on him because it's a tragic story from Boston's past that's often forgotten and not talked about. In hindsight, he should have just retired after his heart condition was discovered, but I can completely understand him not wanting to accept the career-ending diagnosis. Either way, when Lewis died in 1993 at the Celtics off-season practice facility, it truly seemed like there was some sort of curse on the usually touched Celtics franchise. Their 1986 and 87 first-round draft picks both passed away tragically. Len Bias was supposed to be what Michael Jordan became, and Lewis was the Celtics' only real hope of winning a title post-Bird, Parrish, and McHale. The mid-90s were a dismal time for the Celtics. They were in a rebuilding mode, but really they were just treading water. The usual top-shelf Celtics finished the 1996-1997 season with the second worst record in the NBA. The front office knew they needed to make some moves, and fast. The first thing the Celtics did was hire Rick Pitino as their head coach. Pitino had become famous as a winning coach in the NCAA, but as we know, great college coaches don't always make great pro coaches. The former University of Kentucky head coach didn't do well in the pros and eventually went back to the NCAA and had success with the Louisville Cardinals. I actually liked watching the young team of Antoine Walker, Ron Mercer, Chauncey Billups, and Walter McCarty. Remember when Tommy Heinsohn used to say, "I love Walter! I really do, I love Walter!" That used to crack me up, I love that. It was clear though to the Celtics front office that this core wasn't a championship team, so they traded Billups, which wasn't a very popular move. I certainly didn't like it. I like Chauncey Billups, and a side note, he went on to win a championship with the Pistons in 2004. Antoine Walker was drafted in 96 in the first round by the Celtics, and Ron Mercer was drafted in the first round in 97. 2 years in a row, the first round draft picks by the Celtics, both drafted for Pitino's old University of Kentucky squad. The C's definitely were trying something here, but it wasn't exactly quite working. Now in hindsight, I can see like it was more like desperation. The Celtics front office were trying to recreate the University of Kentucky's success, and it wasn't transforming in the NBA. The C's scraped this model and focused more on their 2 young stars, Antoine Walker and their first round draft pick in 98, Paul Pierce. Going forward, they would put everything into these 2 young stars. I honestly liked Antoine Walker better. When he would sink a clutch 3 and do the Walker wiggle, the crowd went nuts. I used to love that. But my cousin, who not by accident ended up becoming a high school basketball coach, would always tell me that Pierce was in fact the better of the 2. Eventually the C's front office would recognize this as well, realizing to win a championship they would have to ditch Walker and give Pierce a couple more key elements, i.e. Garnett and Ray Allen, but that wouldn't come until later. In Paul Pierce's rookie season, he delighted the Boston fans. The University of Kansas Jayhawks star burst into the NBA, averaging 16.5 points per game and finishing 3rd overall in the Rookie of the Year ballot. The Celtics weren't even initially planning on picking Pierce, but he wasn't picked up in the previously 9 picks. The Celtics shock scooped him up at the number 10 pick in the 98 draft. It was funny for Pierce as well, who grew up in Inglewood, California, a suburb of LA, in the shadow of the Lakers' Great Western posturing for him. Pierce, who grew up idolizing Magic Johnson, I'm sure didn't dream of donning the Celtics green. Nonetheless, Pierce took his place in the storied Celtics squad very serious. Pierce had an even better sophomore season in Boston, averaging 19.5 points per game. Leading up to his third season in the Celtics uniform, Pierce and the Boston fans were expecting a breakout season. Like I mentioned, Pierce was from Inglewood, California. Although he was born in the extremely rough Bay City of Oakland, California, he moved to Inglewood at an early age and spent the vast majority of his life there. Inglewood has always been known as a very red city. In the 80s and 90s, along with South Central, Compton, and Watts, was one of the most fearsome reputations in America. Pierce's teammate Antoine Walker was also from the very tough city of Chicago. I'm not sure if Walker felt the same way, but it's been speculated to me by certain people that perhaps Pierce, being from the much larger and more well-known LA area, thought Boston was maybe kind of soft, or sweet as they put it. Boston, which wasn't on the national radar as much as larger cities like New York, LA, or Chicago, maybe seemed less dangerous. But for those who lived in Boston during that time period, you know that anything could be farther from the truth. Pierce, like a lot of young athletes, enjoyed the nightlife in the beginning of his career. Especially in a smaller city like Boston, a professional athlete would definitely stand out in a nightclub. Naturally, when Pierce, who was not a local who went out in the Boston nightclub scene, brought attention upon himself and was not always of the positive variety. Of course, when a 6'7" tall NBA star walks in a nightclub, obviously the majority of female patrons will take notice, especially because usually pro athletes travel in packs, and it's probably pretty obvious when they enter a club, especially basketball players who are about a foot taller than everyone else. Pierce himself will admit that prior to the incident at the Buzz Club, he had his priorities messed up. He himself says that he should have been spending more time on the basketball court and less time in nightclubs, and this probably never would have happened in the first place. But hindsight is almost always 20/20. Like I said, I can't get anyone to cite any particular instances that led up to this night. It might have been that these guys and Paul Pierce had bumped into each other at clubs in the past and had history, or maybe this was an isolated incident and like someone told me it just wasn't Paul Pierce's night. Either way, in the early morning of September 25th, 2000, Pierce, along with his teammate Tony Pitino and his brother, attended a private party at the Buzz Club on Stewart Street in Boston's Theater District. Also in attendance were various different people. Some of the more notable attendees were Raymond Scott, aka Benzino, and Marco Enos, aka E. Devious. Accompanying them were other members of the Made Men rap Entourage, along with guys who were loosely affiliated with them, some being members of street organizations. This is where the whole story gets sticky. The media was all about attaching Made Men and Benzino to this story because at the time he was become a poster boy for negativity by law enforcement and the media in the city of Boston. Although people from outside Boston think that the city has little rap history or little to do with rap's overall history, they are very mistaken. And a big part of Boston's rap history were those two men, Benzino and E. Devious. Before Made Men, they were both members of the Boston early rap group called the Almighty RSO. The Almighty RSO is one of Boston's early and more memorable rap groups from the late 1980s and early 90s. Along with Ed O.G. and the Bulldogs, and even though Guru and Premier are thought to be from New York, Gang Starr is and was a Boston group. This has to be said though, before all of them came Cool G and the TDS Mob from the south end of Boston, not to be confused with Cool G Rap from New York City. Unfortunately for Almighty RSO, their biggest song came under huge scrutiny by law enforcement agencies in and around the city and other cities as well. It was thought to be an anthem for the violence that was engulfing the inner city neighborhoods of Boston. Changed and reformed as Made Men, the bad press and ire of law enforcement followed them. Just 6 months before the incident with Pierce at a concert at the Fleet Center sponsored by Cash Money and Rough Riders, several comedians performed as well as Cash Money artists and Made Men artists. During the concert, a melee ensued where 5 people got poked in the stands. Again, it was Made Men's name that was attached to the negativity. It seemed like even with the legitimate success in the music industry, with E. Devious fashion as well, authorities and media were always trying to tie them to violence. While Benzino was a rapper, he did have a street history as well. He was from the Four Corners neighborhood of Dorchester, and if you watch my previous videos or you grew up in Boston, you know that that's Four Corner Pirates territory, of which Benzino was down with. Through a fellow RSO member though, he became associated with one of Boston's oldest and most notorious crews. Tony Johnson, who was a member of the Almighty RSO, and his families are legends in the Corbett Street area of Dorchester. They are seen as central figures in organizing that area. I really want to talk to people that were around the late 70s and early 80s before everything went crazy in the later part of that decade. It was a transformation era as far as the streets go, and there isn't a lot documented about it. Unfortunately for Tony Johnson, he lost his life at the early age of 21 while standing in his driveway. Apparently his death was over a personal issue involving a female. The perpetrator of the crime was a young man from these infamous housing projects, the Academy Homes, named Lawrence Guild. Even though Johnson passed away, the connections he made with Benzino, E. Devious, and other members of the group in his neighborhood of Corbett Street lasted. Mike McNeil at M3, which stands for Mass Murdering Mike, is a wise guy affiliated rapper who hails from Corbett. He also had nothing to do with the actual incident with Paul Pierce, but was caught up in the events of the night. Mike McNeil, who was a rapper affiliated with the Made Men, was originally rumored to be sought for questioning by the police sources directly after the events of September 25, 2000. Also mentioned when people talk about Corbett is the number 915. 915 is the number of the building the guys from Corbett hang out in front of. If you watch M3 Mike McNeil's video on YouTube, The Monster, he and a bunch of guys are hanging out in front of the 915 building. And in the song he says, quote, "We used to call our clique Junior Corbett." People I talk to still say they have a heavy presence around 915. I highly doubt when Paul Pierce showed up to the Buzz Club on the night he was thinking about any of this or was even relatively aware of it. I think to a certain degree he probably was a bit arrogant. I don't think he took the time like Reggie Lewis to ingratiate himself into the local culture. Paul Pierce was a stranger in a strange land. Growing up in Inglewood, California, which was in the orbit of South Central, Compton, and Watts, etc., which in the late 80s and early 90s really was a virtual war zone, couldn't have been easy. It's not to say that one environment was worse than the other. Boston and Los Angeles are completely different cities. Boston is ancient by American standards, and even at its peak never was more than around 600,000 residents. While LA, America's second largest city, has around 3 million people in the city and probably over 4 million in the metro area. LA is a much newer city, only recently being built up in the second half of the 20th century. It also has a much more spread out city with a lot of single family homes. Boston is much more cramped and densely populated. There wasn't as much city planning involved with Boston, it just kind of evolved. But you can see how Pierce might have come into Boston thinking it was soft compared to where he was from. People outside of Boston really weren't aware of how the streets worked. They didn't have a national rep like New York, LA, or Chicago. Regardless of what Paul Pierce thought about the city or what he may have actually known about Boston's inner city neighborhood politics, I can't definitively speak on, but what I am sure of is that he found out some stuff about Boston that night and it changed how he viewed the city from then on. It also changed the way he moved for the rest of his career. Although he really didn't open up about it until much later in life, and it certainly didn't show on the court, the events of September 25, 2000 shook Paul Pierce to his core. He suffered from PTSD, anxiety attacks, and deep depression after. Large groups of people gave him anxiety, and if people bumped into him or even rubbed up against him, it freaked him out much more than he probably let on. The Buzz Club on Stewart Street apparently went by several different names and featured different themes on nights of the week. The club was hosting some sort of private party the night that Paul Pierce attended. Now, the actual events that took place that night have been contested by different people, and even through the people I talked to, I can't really get a definitive answer. What is clear, though, is that while Benzino and E. Devious were there at some part in the evening, they had absolutely nothing to do with the actual events. I doubt M3 Mike McNeil had anything to do with this as well. I just think the fact that he was from Corbett and was loosely affiliated with the Made Men, his name was brought up by police. Also, I'm not 100% sure of the motive behind this because witnesses changed their stories probably for various reasons. I'm sure the closest explanation for the assault is something like Pierce was talking too familiar with a woman who was part of that group and someone didn't like it so they assaulted Pierce. Then two of their friends jumped in and it got really ugly. Apparently it became part of a larger fracas including up to 20 people. Luckily for Pierce, his teammate Tony Pitino and his brother threw Pierce into Petit's car and drove him to the New England Medical Center, which was right around the corner from the Buzz Club. Pierce, who had a bottle smashed over the back of his head, was also poked 11 times in the face, neck, and back, one going as far as 7 inches deep. Doctors said an inch in any direction he would have surely died. His teammate drove him around the corner to the hospital. Doctors said the close proximity to the scene of the crime plus the fact that Pierce was wearing a heavy leather jacket probably saved his life. He walked into the hospital, but it was quickly apparent that he was in critical condition. He lost a lot of blood and one of his lungs had collapsed. After hours of surgery, Pierce stabilized and eventually made a quick recovery. Within a week, Pierce was discharged from the hospital, and to almost everyone's shock, less than a month later, Pierce started in the Celtics season opener. He went on to play every single one of the regular season games that year. But when the news broke the morning after the incident, nobody in Boston knew it was going to happen. I think most people were anticipating the worst. First Len Bias, then Reggie Lewis. Now we're going to lose our latest prospect, Paul Pierce, to some senseless nightclub altercation. If that had happened, it certainly would have seemed like the Celtics were under the same sort of curse like the Red Sox of old. But it didn't happen. Paul Pierce, like I said, persevered, and later with the addition of Kevin Garnett and Ray Allen, would finally get another banner for the C's in 2008, and then only to lose a heartbreaking 7-game series in 2010 to Kobe Bryant and the dreaded LA Lakers. But Paul Pierce has cemented himself as a Boston sports legend, in my opinion, is one of the all-time greats. I had the honor of being present with my brother to watch his career-high 50-point performance against LeBron James and the Cavaliers on February 15th, 2006 at the Boston Garden, the new Boston Garden. When Shaq grabbed the mic from the reporter that one time and said Paul Pierce was the truth, he was not kidding. Pierce scored 17 points in the fourth quarter of that game alone to force OT. Everyone else basically backed away, and LeBron and Pierce were playing one-on-one. LeBron was no slouch in this game either. He had a triple-double with 43 points, 11 assists, 12 boards, 4 blocks, and 2 steals. Pierce fouled out in the middle of double OT and the Cavs won, but it was one of the most epic basketball games or surreal situations that I've ever seen in person. People kept leaving because it was getting so late in the night and it was a weeknight, so we just kept moving up closer and closer till we were almost courtside by the end of the game. My cousin epically turned down coming to the game because he couldn't miss another night class at Framingham State, which I have to add that he eventually dropped out of, and I never, apparently still to this day, will ever let him live that down. So I just wanted to add that in there, that I have personally experienced what a phenomenon Paul Pierce could be on the court. I think for the most part he wanted to just leave the events of September 25th, 2000 behind him and move on with his career and personal life. At the trial for Paul Pierce's accused attackers, he took the stand and said he couldn't identify the attackers because he was being attacked from every direction. It's a true statement, but also a very convenient one. Pierce clearly did not want any further problems with any Boston hoods. He reported several months after being attacked that he was receiving threatening phone calls stemming from the incident. This prompted him to ask for a security detail around his residence. He also hired a personal bodyguard. If when he first came to Boston he thought that the city was soft as sweet, he now realized that this was not the case. Different street factions, whether it be Corbett, 915, or any other street/housing project in Boston's inner city, were no joke and not to be played with. No matter what city someone hails from, when they're in Boston, they need to respect the local politics. Benzino and E. Devious have always tried to distance themselves from this instance, and even though violence seemed to follow them, especially Benzino throughout his career, they really were falsely painted in a negative light over this incident in particular by the media. The charges for attempting to take Pierce's life were eventually dropped, but the two men were found guilty of assault with a deadly weapon. One man was sentenced to a little over a year, while the other man was sentenced to 7 to 10 years. Not the stiffest penalties, ultimately, considering how close Pierce came to losing his life. The third man, who was accused of hitting Pierce in the head with a bottle, wasn't sentenced to prison at all. You can easily find the names of all 3 of these men online if you'd like. I'd rather not mention them on this video. I know one of them is doing a lengthy prison sentence for another more recent crime, but maybe the other 2 have changed their lives and don't want their names brought up in this video. I'd just rather not upset people if I don't have to. I feel like I take a little bit of a risk just mentioning Corbett and 915 at all in connection with this, but I'd be failing to tell the story right if I didn't mention it. Either way, like I said, the penalties could have been much worse. I just think it was a messy case for the prosecution, so they probably wanted to try to get any conviction that they could. Witnesses recanting testimony, people trying to protect friends and family, Pierce being reluctant to testify, All reasons that everyone wanted this case to be settled and go away. For Pierce, like I said, it changed the way he moved. He respected Boston in a much different way after the incident at the Buzz Club. He no longer went out to clubs. He rededicated himself to basketball and to the C's winning another title. I was kind of hoping that Tatum and Brown and Smart were going to win us a couple more. Now Smart's gone, and I'm losing faith in Tatum as the guy who can get it done. Luckily, they're still extremely young, and all I know is I'm glad Kyrie is long gone. I really didn't like that guy. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It's been requested since I started the channel. It's a huge piece of Boston lore, and it ties into the stuff I've been talking about lately. So here is my Christmas gift to you guys. Merry Christmas, by the way. Hopefully you guys will hear from me before the new year. Try to have a good holiday. If you don't celebrate Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Blessed Kwanzaa. If you don't celebrate anything, just try to have a decent day, guys. Most importantly, make good decisions, make good choices, take good care of yourself, your family, your friends, your fellow human beings. Like I said, try to have a good day, guys. I will talk to you soon. God bless.